On October 12, 1964, the Soviet Union launches Voskhod 1 into orbit around the Earth. It remains a controversial mission because of high-risk decisions pushed by Soviet politicians. So, what made the mission so dangerous? And who put pressure on the Russian space program to carry it out? Let's find out. But first, we need some background. The Cold War was at its height in the late 1950s and early 60s, and the space race was a major part of it. Beginning with Sputnik in 1957, the Russians had beaten the US to every major milestone in the early years of the space race. Voskhod 1 was yet another in a line of firsts achieved by the Soviet Union. The three-man mission was the first to carry a multi-person crew, and the first spaceflight performed without spacesuits. Russian cosmonauts Vladimir Komarov, Konstantin Feoktistov, and Boris Yegorov orbited the Earth 16 times during the mission, which lasted 24 hours and 17 minutes. The choice to not utilize spacesuits during the flight was a dangerous one, and was necessary because the capsule was originally designed for just one person, and was not large enough to accommodate 3 men along with their bulky spacesuits. If the capsule had depressurized at any point during the mission, the lack of spacesuits would have meant certain death for the 3 cosmonauts. Additionally, the craft included no ejection seat in order to make room for the crew members, meaning that there was no escape route if something had gone wrong during the launch. The decision to have Voskhod 1 carry 3 cosmonauts was pushed on the Russian space program for propaganda reasons by politicians led by Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, who had come to power 11 years earlier. It may seem strange that Khrushchev would push so hard for a 3-man crew when no one had even done 2 yet, but it was an especially volatile time in Soviet politics, and Khrushchev was feeling enormous pressure to keep Russia ahead of the US, whose space program was inching closer and closer to catching up with the Soviets. Khrushchev wanted to demonstrate to the world, but even more importantly to his political rivals in the government, that Russia was still number 1 in the space race. He felt like he needed a big public win just to stay in power. Although the Voskhod 1 mission was a success, the gamble did not pay off for Khrushchev. On the day of the launch, the Soviet leader was at Pitsunda, at his state-owned vacation home on the Black Sea in the Soviet Republic of Georgia. Soon after speaking to the Voskhod 1 cosmonauts by radio phone, Khrushchev was summoned back to Moscow and informed that he had been voted out of power by the nation's ruling body, known as the Presidium. Khrushchev was officially dismissed by the Central Committee 2 days later. The new premier, Leonid Brezhnev, made his first appearance as Soviet leader when he publicly greeted the returning Voskhod 1 cosmonauts. By the way, the only other Voskhod mission, Voskhod 2, had a 2-man crew. Spacesuits were a necessity for that mission since it included the first ever spacewalk, but still, no ejection seat. Although the Russians had achieved yet another first with Voskhod 1, the US launched its own mission with a multi-person crew just 5 months later, in March 1965, when 2 astronauts, Gus Grissom and John Young, flew Gemini 3. Gus Grissom was one of the original Mercury 7 astronauts. He was the second American in space and the first to fly 2 missions. He was then slated for the first manned Apollo mission, but was killed along with Ed White and Roger Chaffee in a fire during a routine launch pad test for that mission. For John Young, Gemini 3 was his first ever space mission. He would go on to make 5 more voyages in space, including Apollo 16, where he became the 9th of only 12 humans to walk on the moon. Additionally, Young was the backup to Mission Commander Jim Lovell for the Apollo 13 spaceflight, and also commanded the first ever space shuttle mission in 1981. His final trip to space was on the 9th Space Shuttle mission in 1983, when he was 53. Each Gemini flight was a two-man mission, so the US did not send its own three-man crew to space until Apollo 7 in October 1968, 4 years after the risky but successful Voskhod 1 mission. Well, successful for everyone but Khrushchev. Here are other events that happened today in history. In 1492, Columbus makes landfall in the Americas on an island in what is now the Bahamas. In 1870, former Confederate General Robert E. Lee dies of a stroke in Virginia at age 63. In 1935, Italian tenor Luciano Pavarotti, one of the most successful in history, is born in Modena. In 1997, John Denver dies when his amateur aircraft crashes into Monterey Bay in California. In 1998, University of Wyoming student Matthew Shepard dies after an attack by anti-gay bigots. In 2000, Al-Qaeda terrorists blow a hole in the side of the USS Cole in Yemen, killing 17 Americans. In 2022, a Connecticut jury awards Sandy Hook victims' families $965 million from Alex Jones. And now it's time for our Today in History quiz. Who was the first U.S. president to live in the White House? George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, or James Madison? Liked learning about Voskhod 1? Then you'll love this one about Sputnik, the satellite that started it all. Tap the screen to keep the story going on Today in History.